our next speaker, who will deliver the closing remarks of the conference, needs no introduction. He is a famous British politician and also a great friend of Afghanistan. His involvement in Afghanistan started with his famous trek, which ended with his book, Places in Between. Also, we know his great work through his Turqua Mountain, Pharaoh's Cove, and I'm delighted that Sandy Ball chose him to write an introduction for his book. So I would kindly ask Rory Stewart to deliver us his closing remarks, and I will apologize for the delay. I mean, in this kind of setting, it's inevitable. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all very much. And I greatly enjoyed hearing this extraordinary collection of people. I mean, it's a deeply, deeply tragic moment in Afghanistan, but it's also wonderful to see so many extraordinary distinguished friends of Afghanistan gathering and talking with such intellect and with such passion about Afghanistan and its challenges. We are centered today in this conference on the question of Commander Massoud and his legacy, and in particular through the extraordinary lens provided by Sandy Gall's remarkable portrait and his edition of Commander Massoud's diaries. And I think there is something there which is very striking. Not only the courage of Sandy Gall himself, which I think we should pay tribute to, the fact that he entered Afghanistan actually already as a 54-year-old when he first met Ahmad Shah Massoud in an extremely dangerous moment of the Soviet war. But above all, the way in which Commander Massoud's life suggests something incredibly important about the way that we think, not just about Afghanistan, but many other countries, right the way across to places like Bosnia. What does Commander Massoud mean for the international community, for the US and its allies engaged in intervention? And we have to start, I think, with the central issue. The central issue is this. Commander Massoud was the most extraordinary human individual. I mean, a man of the most remarkable courage, modesty, actually quite considerable erudition and understatement. But that is not, and this is the uncomfortable fact in the middle of this conference, how he was perceived by some people. Of course, almost his entire adult life, from when he began at the age of 22 to his premature death in his 40s, was spent at war, and in one of the most horrifying contexts of war imaginable. And he is remembered, of course, by some people, including people within the US administration in the 1990s and critics today, as a commander, as somebody who was associated with the Panjshir-Tajik community, and of course, as somebody who was associated with the tragic civil war in Afghanistan in the 1990s and the horrors in Kabul, particularly in 1994. Now, I'm going to go on to say that actually Commander Massoud was a real model. He is, in a genuine sense, a national hero for Afghanistan. But to understand what kind of hero he was involves being honest about some of the problems involved in this and the story that that suggests about Afghanistan itself. Because, of course, probably the fundamental issue that Commander Massoud faced in the 1990s was that the US administration insisted on seeing him purely as just another warlord. Right? There are these quotes, Dick Armitage saying, he is an unacceptable ally. Robin Raphael, who says, he's a warlord in it only for himself and the Tajiks. It wasn't for us to choose between warlords who are tainted. Let them choose amongst themselves. Now, this is a very important bit of rhetoric, because this is, of course, the very same rhetoric that leads to the abandonment and isolation, which we have just seen under President Biden. And it meant that every engagement that the international community had with Afghanistan was an extraordinary combination of totally unrealistic optimism and profound pessimism, a complete inability to find its way towards any form of moderate middle ground, a total inability to wrestle with the reality of what was happening in Afghanistan. The examples of that perhaps most clear, of course, through the way in which the international community engaged with the presidents of Afghanistan. Ashraf Ghani represents the extreme optimism of the international community. He represents the fantasy of the international community that somehow you could simply bring in somebody who hadn't lived in Afghanistan for decades, straight from a distinguished position in an American university, with his book on fixing failed states, and he would come in with his 10 functions of a state. And many people were charmed by this. Ambassador Holbrooke loved the fact that President Ghani kept insisting the Taliban were not really a threat. There wasn't any real reason to deal with any of the power holders in the countryside, and that in fact it was possible for Afghanistan. I remember President Ghani saying this to me in the early 2000s when I worked with him, that it was possible to turn Afghanistan into the Dubai of Central Asia. On the other hand, we had our relationship with President Karzai, which rapidly lapsed into extreme pessimism. Rather than acknowledging that President Karzai had some considerable strengths as a politician as well as weaknesses, quite quickly the international community decided to try to portray him as a villain. And this was particularly unfortunate. I mean, it's viewed at a micro level in someone like Helmand. This means that the international community goes in 2004, 2005, and essentially launches a second intervention into Afghanistan designed with international troops to topple the very people that President Karzai has appointed in provinces around Afghanistan. Now, I'm not saying there are any easy answers to this, right? This question of how you deal with Afghan power holders and warlords is a very, very difficult question. But we should at least now see that there were no easy options. Of course, leaving Sher Mohammad Akhundzadeh and the Norzai police militia and the Barakzai army unit in place in Helmand led to horror for people in Helmand, particularly in places like Sangin, the most horrifying life. On the other hand, removing them created a vacuum, undermined directly the authority of the elected president of Afghanistan, drove the militias into the hands of the Taliban, made the warlords associate themselves with the Taliban, and left a power vacuum that we were unable to control. And we did it by putting foreign troops on the ground that gave the Taliban suddenly the calling card they needed, the legitimacy to present themselves as fighting for Afghanistan and Islam against a foreign military occupation. Which brings us back to Commander Massoud. Commander Massoud is a reminder that there are better choices. The choice doesn't need to be between, on the one hand, a fantasy of some American professor with a formula for fixing a failed state on the one hand, or somebody like Dostum or Gulaga Shirzai on the other. It is possible to find figures who were involved on the ground, who fought, who were embedded in Afghan society, who understood it, to accept that they have flaws, to accept that, of course, they have ethnic allegiances, to accept that, of course, they have complicated histories, but that there are better and worse examples. And this was the secret, in fact, to the international success in Bosnia. If you look at what happened in Bosnia, the international community didn't have an extraordinary idealistic fantasy. It worked with people like Karadzic and Plavcic initially, actually with war criminals, until eventually they moved to move them aside through very elaborate political compromises and eventually try them in The Hague, leading to peace, leading to refugee return, and leading eventually in Bosnia to a situation in which the homicide rate was lower than Sweden. So we finish now in a situation in which this same inability to understand figures like Commander Massoud, an inability to take on the lesson that Sandy Gall so powerfully gives us in that book, that Commander Massoud represents something extraordinary. Firstly, his immense modesty. One of the reasons it's difficult to write a biography of him is that he was so reluctant actually to show off in interviews. His grace, the way that he conducted himself in Afghan houses, his courage, his refusal to leave Afghanistan during the entire Soviet period, his obvious willingness to give up his life, his immense fragility and sense of responsibility. The diaries record sleepless nights, agonizing. His ability to take incredible personal risk trying to reach out to the Taliban. All these things provide us with a model of how we could think about engaging more thoughtfully and realistically in contexts like Afghanistan. And a reminder that the cheap, naive pessimism of those Americans, the cheap, naive pessimism of those assistant secretaries of state who tried to say in the 1990s, all Afghans the same, the whole thing is a mess, or the cheap, naive pessimism of President Biden, who now is trying to suggest ludicrously that Afghans are somehow incompetent cowards, is totally disgusting and outrageous. This is shameful. And in fact, this lurch from optimism to pessimism, from megalomania to paranoia that characterizes the fantasies of the Western interveners has now again dropped Afghanistan into horror. Dropped Afghanistan not just into the horror of the loss of civil and political rights, not just the horror of what it means to be a woman in Afghanistan at the moment, but actually the horror now of a country which is facing starvation, a country where it is almost impossible to imagine how we are going to be able to get any form of economic activity going or get the health and education systems supported. So this is a plea at this very particular moment not to fall into cheap stories about horror and warlords, to remember Commander Massoud, an example of a practical, real person who showed extraordinary grace and represents the kind of hope that we could have been looking for in Afghanistan, and to remember it particularly at this moment, this extraordinary moment, where Sandy Gall, who at my age stood on that bridge in Saigon in 1975 and saw the Americans leave Vietnam, should live long enough, not just 20 years beyond the death of Commander Massoud, but long enough to now see this shameful abandonment repeated again. Thank you.
Thank you for very, very moving and thoughtful comments, and I have no words to thank you. Thank you, Rory. And though now, at the final part of this conference that I'm trying to close, I would like to start with a story. As Ahmed Massoud started this conference by his message,